Schizophrenia, A Closer Look at a Complex Mental Illness by Madeline Polk. The understanding of schizophrenia has undergone an intense evolution throughout history, consistently enduring changes and challenges, stereotypes, and stigmas. The term has been misused, twisted, and molded into something by Hollywood, dramatized stories, and even by those who simply throw the term around without an understanding of its true significance. Famous household names and embellished stories include that of Mary Todd Lincoln, Vincent van Gogh, Zelda Fitzgerald, all of which may have dealt with schizophrenia themselves. While the definition of schizophrenia itself is relatively new, the concept of mental illness goes back to even the earliest civilizations. Before I discuss the history of schizophrenia, I will give a brief overview of the history of mental illness itself. In ancient times, mental illness was thought to be caused by demons or ancestral spirits. In Greco-Roman times, they moved to a more naturalistic view due to Hippocrates and people like Plato's views. In the Middle Ages, there was a reversion back to the supernatural beliefs, and this was a very dark time for everyone involved, but especially those with mental illness. And finally, the Enlightenment/moral treatment movement brought a change that continued in an uphill trend throughout history to a more naturalistic view once again, with humanism taking hold and an advocacy for moral treatment. Some of the faces of early research regarding schizophrenia specifically are Kraepelin, Bleuler, and Schneider. All three of these men were extremely influential in the development of schizophrenia as we know it today. Kraepelin, known for his textbook of psychiatry, which is still referenced to this day, used the term dementia praecox to describe symptoms such as hallucinations, confused speech, and more. Kurt Schneider then used this list and made it more consistent and helped it become more recognizable by ranking the symptoms in a specific way. Bleuler was a Swiss psychiatrist who was actually the first to use the word schizophrenia. He chose the word over the previously used dementia praecox because of its root in a phrase meaning a mind that is torn asunder. While he focused on one phenotype, he also believed that the cause was psychological, not neurobiological. He emphasized the importance of the splitting of the brain as opposed to the other symptoms that people like Kraepelin addressed. The research on schizophrenia only continued from here. Our knowledge as a whole has definitely grown and evolved, but there is still much debate over the truth of what schizophrenia really is, what the cause of it is, and what the eventual outcome of those who have this mental disorder is. Questions like these lead us to the etiology of schizophrenia. To this day, the etiology of schizophrenia is highly debated. Many have tried to grasp at one distinct cause for the disorder, but it appears that a more holistic approach has better results. A multidimensional model incorporates biological factors, social factors, and many more that provide a basis for better understanding where the core of schizophrenia lies. Some examples within these dimensions are positive family history, meaning having a close relative that has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. This significantly increases the chances of developing it yourself. There are also complications in pregnancy and birth that can lead to schizophrenia development later. Another study discusses how cannabis use, as well as other drugs, can cause a heightened risk for schizophrenia, as well as exacerbating the symptoms of those who already have been diagnosed. Furthermore, another study discussed more social and economic factors that could have an impact. Childhood trauma is especially important, but so are things such as ethnicity, usually regarding minority groups, isolation socially, location, this can mean rural or urban areas, and discrimination and economic adversity also play a role. Perhaps the most prominent area of study regarding schizophrenia is that of neurotransmitter complications. These can include glutamate, serotonin, but especially dopamine. The study of the connection between dopamine and schizophrenia has been coined the dopamine hypothesis. This was originally developed when reports found that psychotic symptoms had decreased in schizophrenia patients who also developed Parkinson's disease. This hypothesis has undergone 3 main alterations, and it changed much with each one. In the beginning, the main idea was that the dopamine receptors were dysfunctional, but the research only developed from there. Now, in the 3rd iteration, the hypothesis attempts to go beyond the simplistic framework of the first hypothesis, and it no longer claims that schizophrenia is completely caused by situations in the brain. Instead, it combines both genetic and environmental causes and provides an evaluation of the complex etiological factors that make up this illness. Moving on now to the diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis of schizophrenia. According to the DSM, symptoms of schizophrenia include delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, meaning a lack of movement or rigid movements, and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms include the symptoms that are tied to psychotic episodes. This can include the hallucinations or delusions, along with signs of motor impairment. Negative symptoms are more elusive, and they are typically emotional or behavioral and can involve a person being withdrawn or less responsive. In order for a diagnosis to be made, at least 2 of the symptoms mentioned previously must be significantly present for at least 1 month and be impairing the person's functioning. There's usually at least a 6-month period of disturbance required, and it's also necessary to determine if other disorders are present. The symptoms have to be unattributable to any substance use or medical condition, and there are other specifications in the instance of autism spectrum disorder, but these are the general qualifications from the DSM. Schizophrenia often develops in the late teens and early 20s, but it differs from person to person. It's characterized by subtle and continual changes in behavior and expression for years leading up to the full expression of symptoms. Oftentimes, psychotic features can mimic the disorder, so it's important to rule those out before diagnosis. And it's also very important when assessing a person to determine if they have had any thoughts of harming themselves or others. For the treatment of schizophrenia, the goal is to combat symptoms, prevent relapse, and to promote adaptive functioning so that the person that has been diagnosed can be included back into the community. Oftentimes, pharmacological treatment is the first course of action. Antipsychotics are usually necessary for the recovery process or even just maintaining a stable state. It is better if these are administered at least within the first 5 years of the first episode. Antipsychotics can have serious side effects, so doctors usually prescribe atypical antipsychotics because these supposedly have less motor side effects. Unfortunately, compliance is very low in schizophrenia, and it is very difficult to get patients to continue their medication properly. On the other hand, non-pharmacological treatments are on the rise and are becoming more popular as time continues. Medication is extremely helpful and often needed, but there are also many other therapies that can be extremely helpful. One of the main ones is cognitive behavioral therapy, but others include family intervention, which can be extremely helpful to provide a support system, employment that provides a structure and a support, and then cognitive remediation, which helps a person with schizophrenia rebuild their cognitive capabilities. One example of a treatment for schizophrenia that is not based in pharmacological treatment is that of music therapy. This study by Hedge and Keshavan describes how analyzing someone's perception of music and rhythm can help researchers better understand the way their cognitive processes work. From there, they can then use music therapy to help treat those specifically with schizophrenia. Music has been seen to impact both glutamate and dopamine levels, which can positively influence schizophrenia recovery. Regarding prognosis, schizophrenia is known for having a poorer one than other mental illnesses. However, very few show a continual downhill progression when treatment is given. Often resilience indicates a potential for somewhat of a recovery. And usually those that do have negative prognosis already have poor adjustment practices and have had a long period of untreated psychosis that leads to an even longer difficult road to receiving a diagnosis. This disorder can be very difficult and debilitating, but it is not defined by a poor outcome. Tina Katulski, who I had the privilege of interviewing and will discuss in a moment, described in her book Saving Millie about her mother that those with schizophrenia may struggle to live on their own and be entirely independent, but with compliance to treatment and a really strong support system, their lives can still be extremely meaningful. For Christians, a biblical perspective regarding mental illness is crucial. Historically, medical care was tied to religion and spirituality, but a shift that happened around the Enlightenment, which was mentioned earlier, caused a disconnect that has only continued over time. Slowly, however, progress has been made to integrate the two again. Pastors are beginning to recognize the importance of counseling and other mental health aspects within the church, and psychologists and psychiatrists and the like are beginning to understand that a person's spirituality may actually be impactful for their mental health and treatment. Specifically regarding Christianity, there has been some conflict surrounding mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. It can be difficult to draw the line between religious experiences explained in the Bible and by others throughout history and that of a mental illness. Despite these challenges and the obstacles that Christians may have to overcome regarding their interpretation of Scripture, of mental illness, and more, it is important to remember that despite opinions on these topics, above all, we are all chosen to love God and love His people. Colossians 3:12 says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience." This verse reminds us exactly how we should treat others and gives us a lens through which we can see those with schizophrenia and everyone that God created. I had the privilege of speaking with Tina Katulski, author of the book Saving Millie, who also runs, along with her husband, Between the Bridges Healing Center. When I asked her what her main advice for someone wanting to learn more about schizophrenia was, she said, "Remember the family." So many times, people only think of the person receiving the diagnosis, but it's never just that one person involved, and it impacts everyone. I asked her what her opinion was on the portrayal of schizophrenia in the media, and she said that she rarely sees it being true and positive, and that it's often very biased. I asked her how she's seen her experience help her in her own understanding, as well as helping others. She said that it has impacted her in so many ways, especially in how she's been able to help and relate to others. This has been through her book, speaking engagements, and even just conversations with those in need. One main point she emphasized was how medication, while important, can sometimes do more harm than good when carelessly overprescribed, and she saw this in her own situation with her mother. One final point, going off of my interview with Ms. Katulski and the earlier mention of antipsychotic medication. Schizophrenia is a disease that requires medical compliance, but it can also be dangerous when doctors prescribe numerous medications without fully evaluating the side effects because of the way they can interact and sometimes harm the individual more than do good. Martyr and Cannon add this table from the DSM into their study to show guidelines for monitoring the side effects of antipsychotic medication. These are just 5 of the possible side effects and ways to monitor them. It is extremely important to evaluate the ways to help those with schizophrenia safely receive the medication that they need.